The security officer's hand struck Dr. Adrienne Marshall's shoulder with enough force to spin her around, her designer handbag flying from her grip and skidding across the polished marble floor of the Riverside Galleria's main atrium. The sound echoed through the three-story shopping complex like a gunshot, sharp and unmistakable, drawing stares from the late afternoon shoppers who'd been browsing the luxury storefronts. Officer Dennis Crawford didn't lower his voice when he spoke, didn't soften the contempt that dripped from every syllable. I said you need to leave the premises immediately. We don't tolerate loitering or soliciting in this establishment. This is your final warning before I call the real police. Adrienne stood perfectly still in the bright October sunlight that poured through the massive skylight overhead, her silk blouse rumpled where his hand had grabbed her pulse hammering in her ears. She could feel the weight of every eye in the atrium on her, could see the familiar calculation happening in the minds of the white shoppers clutching their bags from Nordstrom and Tiffany's, their faces reflecting that particular mixture of discomfort and assumption that she'd spent a lifetime recognizing. They were deciding whether the security officer was right about her, whether someone who looked like her belonged in a place like this, whether she'd done something to deserve being manhandled in broad daylight. Adrienne took a slow breath and picked up her handbag, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the rage building in her chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Then she looked Crawford directly in his eyes and said 5 words that would change both of their lives. I'm the new owner. If that moment just sent electricity down your spine, if you already know this story is about to deliver the justice you've been craving, then hit that like button right now. Share this with everyone who needs to see what happens when prejudice finally meets consequence, when assumptions crash into reality, when power reveals itself in the last person who should have been underestimated. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about the exact moment when the tables turn, when the wronged become the powerful, when justice arrives, not someday, but today. Now let me take you back to understand exactly how Dr. Adrienne Marshall came to be standing in that atrium, exactly what Dennis Crawford's assault would cost him, and exactly why what happened next would become the most satisfying case of instant karma you'll hear this year. Adrienne Marshall had learned early that the world made assumptions about Black women that had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with fear. She'd grown up in West Baltimore, daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them in a small apartment with heat that worked most of the time and schools that didn't. Her mother, Patricia Marshall, cleaned houses in the wealthy suburbs during the day and worked the night shift at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the laundry department. Adrienne had spent her childhood doing homework in hospital break rooms and falling asleep in the back seats of buses while her mother traveled between jobs. But Patricia had dreams that were bigger than her circumstances. She told Adrienne from the time she could understand words that education was the only ladder that couldn't be pulled up behind you, that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take away, that excellence was the only answer to people who expected mediocrity from girls who looked like them. Adrienne had absorbed those lessons like gospel. She'd been the kid who read by flashlight under her covers after bedtime, who finished her homework on the bus, who raised her hand in every class even when the other kids rolled their eyes, who applied to every scholarship she could find and wrote essays until her fingers cramped. She'd gotten into Princeton on a full ride, graduated summa cum laude, and went on to Harvard Business School, where she'd been one of 7 Black women in a class of 900. The corporate world had been exactly as hostile as she'd expected, and worse than she'd hoped. Adrienne had spent 15 years climbing the ladder at a major retail real estate investment firm, watching less qualified white men get promoted over her, listening to bosses who praised her work but somehow never quite saw her as leadership material, smiling through meetings where clients asked if she was taking notes or where colleagues assumed she was someone's assistant. She documented everything, every passed-over promotion, every inappropriate comment, every instance where her ideas were dismissed when she proposed them and celebrated when a white male colleague repeated them 5 minutes later. And when the documentation was thick enough and damning enough, she'd filed a lawsuit that had cost the firm $40 million in settlement and reputation damage. She'd used her portion of that settlement to start her own company. Marshall Equity Partners specialized in acquiring underperforming retail properties, renovating them and bringing in diverse tenants who serve communities that traditional real estate developers ignored. In 8 years, she'd built a portfolio worth $200 million. She owned shopping centers in Baltimore and Philadelphia and Atlanta. She'd been featured in Forbes and Black Enterprise. She'd spoken at Harvard and Wharton about building wealth through strategic real estate investment. And 3 weeks ago, she'd closed the deal on her biggest acquisition yet, the Riverside Galleria, a struggling, high-end shopping complex in suburban Maryland that had been hemorrhaging tenants and revenue for 5 years. The previous owners had run the Galleria into the ground through a combination of mismanagement and tone-deaf marketing that alienated the increasingly diverse community surrounding the property. Adrienne had studied the numbers and seen the potential. The location was prime. The bones of the building were solid, and the demographic shift in the surrounding neighborhoods meant there was appetite for retail that reflected the community's actual composition, instead of some outdated fantasy of who the right customers were. She'd paid $60 million for the property and planned to invest another $20 million in renovations and tenant recruitment. But before she started the physical transformation, she wanted to understand the culture of the place, the staff, the current tenants, the actual customer experience. So she'd spent the past 3 weeks doing what she always did with new acquisitions, walking the property at different times of day, observing how staff interacted with customers, noting which stores were thriving and which were dying, listening to the small tells that revealed how a place actually operated versus how it claimed to operate. She'd dress casually during these visits, jeans and a nice blouse, minimal jewelry, nothing that screamed executive or owner. She wanted to see how people behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. And what she'd seen had not been encouraging. She'd watched security follow Black and Latino shoppers while ignoring white teenagers who were clearly shoplifting. She'd seen store clerks enthusiastically greet white customers while barely acknowledging customers of color. She'd heard the security team use code words over their radios that were transparently racial. And she'd made notes about everything, building a case for the complete overhaul of security and management that she'd already been planning. Today was supposed to be her final anonymous observation before the formal transition of ownership tomorrow, when she'd walk into the management office and introduce herself as the new boss. She'd been standing in the atrium near the fountain, checking her phone and reading an email from her attorney about the final paperwork, when Officer Dennis Crawford had approached her. He was a man in his late 40s with the bearing of someone who'd spent a career in positions of minor authority and had learned to extract maximum power from minimal status. He'd started by asking if she needed help finding something, his tone already suspicious. Adrienne had smiled politely and said she was fine, thank you. He'd asked if she was shopping or just hanging around. She'd said she was considering making a purchase and was deciding which store to visit. He'd told her that loitering wasn't permitted and that if she wasn't actively shopping, she needed to move along. Adrienne had felt the familiar anger rising, but had kept her voice level. She'd pointed out that she'd been standing there for less than 5 minutes and that plenty of other people were doing the exact same thing without being harassed. Crawford's expression had hardened. He'd stepped closer, invading her space, and informed her that he'd received complaints about solicitors bothering customers and that she matched the description. It was such an obvious lie that Adrienne had almost laughed. She'd looked around at the atrium full of shoppers, 90% of them white, and asked what description exactly she matched. That's when Crawford had grabbed her shoulder and physically turned her toward the exit. That's when her bag had fallen. That's when the assault had become undeniable and public and documented by at least 6 smartphones that were now recording the interaction. Crawford's face had gone from red to pale when Adrienne said she was the new owner. She'd watched the information try to process behind his eyes, watched him recalculate everything he thought he knew about the situation. But instead of apologizing, instead of stepping back and recognizing the catastrophic mistake he'd just made, Crawford had doubled down. "You're lying. I know the new owner, and that's not you. You need to stop making false claims and leave before I have you arrested for trespassing and impersonating a property owner." Adrienne had smiled then, not a warm smile, the smile of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life and had learned to savor the moment when reality crashed through assumption. She'd pulled her phone from her purse and opened her email, scrolling to the message from her attorney that had been copied to the Galleria's management company. The subject line read, "Final closing documents. Riverside Galleria acquisition. Marshall Equity Partners." She turned the phone so Crawford could read it, watched his face as he scanned the text, and saw the signatures in the official transfer of ownership that had been executed at 9 a.m. that morning. "I closed the deal this morning. As of today, I own this property, I own this building, I own every store lease, and I own the contract with the security company that employs you. Now, would you like to tell me your name and badge number, or should I just request the personnel files for everyone who was working today and figure out which one of you put his hands on me?" Crawford's mouth opened and closed several times without sound emerging. Around them, the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation was growing larger. Adrienne could see phones recording from multiple angles, could see the viral video forming in real time, could see her mother's voice in her head saying, "Document everything, baby. Make them regret underestimating you." Crawford seemed to realize simultaneously that he was being recorded and that his career was over. He took a step back, his hands rising in a placating gesture that was about 20 minutes too late to matter. "Ma'am, I apologize. There was a misunderstanding. If you'll just come with me to the security office, we can sort this out." Adrienne shook her head slowly. "No, we're not going anywhere private. We're staying right here where everyone can see and record what happens next. You assaulted me. You put your hands on me without cause or justification. You accused me of soliciting and loitering when I was standing peacefully in a public space. You did all of this because you saw a black woman and assumed she didn't belong in a high-end shopping center. And you did it on camera in front of witnesses in the building that I own." She paused to let that sink in. "Here's what happens next. You're going to stand right there and not move while I call the actual police to file an assault report. Then you're going to explain to your supervisor and the security company exactly what you did. And then you're going to be terminated and banned from this property permanently. Do you understand?" Crawford looked around at the crowd, perhaps hoping someone would intervene or defend him. But the faces surrounding them reflected a range of emotions from shock to satisfaction to the uncomfortable recognition that they just witnessed exactly the kind of racial profiling that everyone knew happened, but rarely got caught on camera this blatantly. One of the white women who'd been watching pulled out her phone and started typing, and Adrienne knew the story was already spreading across social media. "Good, let it spread. Let everyone see what happened when you assumed. Let everyone see what it cost." Adrienne had called 911 and reported the assault in a calm, clear voice that gave the dispatcher her name, her position as property owner, and a detailed description of what had occurred. While they waited for the police to arrive, Crawford stood frozen in place like a man watching his life collapse in real time. The mall's general manager, a man named Robert Chen, came rushing into the atrium looking panicked. He'd apparently been alerted by one of the store managers about a confrontation involving security. When he saw Adrienne standing there with her phone in her hand and Crawford looking like he wanted to disappear into the marble floor, Chen's expression shifted from concern to horror. "Dr. Marshall, I didn't know you were... I wasn't informed you'd be... I'm so sorry. I don't understand what's happening." Adrienne turned her attention to Chen. "What's happening is that your security officer assaulted me because he assumed I was loitering or soliciting. He put his hands on me. He threw my bag across the floor. He threatened to have me arrested. All of this is on camera from multiple angles. I assume you're going to want to review the footage." Chen looked at Crawford with an expression of pure fury. "Is this true? Did you put your hands on Dr. Marshall?" Crawford's voice came out as a whisper. "I didn't know who she was." Adrienne stepped forward, her voice sharp. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't know who I was, so you made assumptions based on what I look like. Tell me something. Would you have grabbed a white woman in an expensive suit and demanded she leave? Would you have assumed she was soliciting? Or is that special treatment reserved for black women who don't meet your standards for who belongs in places like this?" The silence that followed was damning. Chen turned to Crawford and said in a tight voice, "You're suspended immediately. Security will escort you from the property and you're not to return. I'll be contacting your supervisor to initiate termination proceedings." Crawford finally found his voice. You can't fire me over a misunderstanding. I was doing my job. She was acting suspicious. Adrienne felt the rage that she'd been controlling finally break through her professional composure. Acting suspicious. I was standing still, checking my email, in broad daylight, in business casual attire, bothering absolutely nobody. And that was suspicious to you. Do you want to explain what about my behavior was suspicious? Or do you want to admit that the only thing suspicious to you was my skin color in a space you've decided belongs to white people? The police arrived before Crawford could respond. Two officers, one white and one black, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else than mediating a situation that had already been decided by the court of public opinion streaming live on social media. Adrienne provided her statement with the precision of someone who'd been prepared for this moment her entire life. She described the assault, identified the witnesses, provided the footage from her own phone that had been recording in her purse from the moment Crawford first approached. The black officer listened with an expression that suggested he'd heard this story too many times before in too many variations. He took Crawford's statement, which consisted mostly of increasingly desperate justifications about responding to complaints and maintaining security and not knowing who she was. When the officer asked if there had actually been any complaints about solicitors, Crawford admitted there hadn't been. He'd made that up. The officer closed his notebook and looked at Adrienne. Ma'am, you have enough for assault charges if you want to press them. Given the video evidence and the witnesses, it's an open and shut case. What would you like to do? Adrienne considered. She could press charges, could put Crawford through the legal system, could add a criminal record to the unemployment and public humiliation he was already facing. Part of her wanted exactly that, wanted him to feel every consequence of his actions. But another part of her, the part that sounded like her mother, knew that there was a different kind of justice available here. I'm not going to press criminal charges, she said finally, but I am going to file a civil suit against the security company for failing to properly train their employees and for creating a culture that enabled this kind of discrimination. And I'm going to make sure that every news outlet, every social justice organization, and every community group in Maryland knows what happened here today. I'm going to make this a case study in what happens when you assume someone doesn't belong because of what they look like. She turned to Crawford directly. You're going to be the example. Not because I'm vindictive, but because maybe the next security guard who thinks about putting his hands on a black woman for the crime of existing in a nice building will remember what it cost you and think twice. Crawford's face had gone gray. The officer nodded and made notes. Chen stood to the side, looking like he was calculating the PR disaster that was about to consume the Galleria. And the crowd of shoppers, which had grown to over 50 people, slowly began to disperse, their phones still recording, their social media already buzzing with the video and the story. Adrienne picked up her bag and brushed off her blouse, reclaiming her dignity in the space where Crawford had tried to strip it from her. Mr. Chen, I'll be in the management office at 9 a.m. tomorrow to begin the formal transition. I suggest you spend the rest of today conducting a complete review of your security protocols and preparing a list of every employee who needs to be retrained or replaced, because this culture is about to change dramatically. Chen nodded vigorously. Of course, Dr. Marshall. We'll do a full review. I assure you this doesn't represent the values of the Galleria. Adrienne raised an eyebrow. Actually, it represents exactly the values of the Galleria. That's why I'm here. That's why I bought this property. Because places like this have been operating with these values for decades, and nobody with the power to change it has bothered to try. Well, I have the power now, and I'm bothering. She walked out of the atrium with her head high, aware of the whispers and stares following her, aware of the phones still recording her exit, aware that she'd just become part of a story that would be told and retold across social media as an example of instant karma and justice served. But what mattered more than the viral moment transforming the Galleria from a place that treated customers like her as threats into a place that actually served its community. That night, Adrienne sat in her apartment overlooking Baltimore's Inner Harbor and watched the videos spread across Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. The hashtag Riverside Galleria was trending. The local news had already picked up the story. Her phone was blowing up with messages from friends and colleagues and reporters wanting statements. And somewhere in the noise and attention, Adrienne found herself thinking about her mother. Patricia Marshall had died 2 years ago, 6 months before Adrienne closed her first major property acquisition. She'd fought cancer with the same stubborn determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. And she'd lost that fight in a hospital room where Adrienne had held her hand and promised to make her proud. "You already have, baby," Patricia had whispered. "Now make them respect you." Adrienne had thought making them respect her meant building wealth and success and undeniable achievement. And those things mattered. But today in that atrium, standing in the space where she'd been assaulted and dismissed and assumed to be someone other than who she was, Adrienne had realized that respect came from something else. It came from refusing to be diminished, from standing in the truth of who you were, even when the world tried to tell you that you were wrong for existing in spaces that hadn't been designed for you, from using power not to retaliate but to transform. Crawford would lose his job. The security company would lose the contract when it came up for renewal next month. And the Galleria would become something different under her ownership. A place where Black and brown customers could shop without being followed, where employees reflected the diversity of the community, where excellence meant serving everyone, not just the people who fit someone's narrow idea of who deserved luxury and respect. That was the justice her mother had been talking about. Not the viral moment, not the satisfaction of watching Crawford's face when he realized who she was, but the long work of making sure that what happened to her happened to fewer people in the future. The next morning, Adrienne walked into the Galleria's management office at exactly 9 a.m. wearing a tailored power suit and carrying the leather portfolio that held her plans for the property's transformation. Chen was there with the entire management team, all of them looking nervous and chastened. Adrienne spent 3 hours going through her expectations. New security protocols that emphasize de-escalation and customer service over intimidation. Mandatory anti-bias training for every employee. A complete audit of how different customers were treated in the stores. New tenant recruitment focused on diversity. And a community advisory board that would ensure the Galleria actually served the neighborhood instead of trying to wall itself off from it. She also announced that she'd be working on-site 3 days a week for the next 6 months, making herself visible, making it impossible for the old culture to reassert itself the moment she looked away. The Riverside Galleria is going to become a model for what retail spaces can be when they stop seeing diversity as a problem to be managed and start seeing it as the reality to be embraced, she told the assembled managers. Some of you will embrace this change and thrive. Others won't. But either way, this is the direction we're moving. Are there any questions? There were many questions about timelines and budgets and specific protocols. Adrienne answered them all with the confidence of someone who'd spent 8 years doing exactly this kind of transformation. By the time the meeting ended, the management team looked less nervous and more energized. Or at least most of them did. A few looked like they were already updating their resumes, which was fine. The people who couldn't adapt to treating all customers with dignity probably shouldn't be in customer service anyway. Over the following months, the Galleria began to change. The security company contract was terminated and replaced with a firm that specialized in community-oriented security practices. The new guards were trained in conflict resolution and cultural competency. Employees who were caught discriminating against customers were fired immediately with no second chances. And slowly, the customer base began to shift. Black and Latino families who'd avoided the Galleria because it didn't feel welcoming started coming back. The stores that adapted to serve this diversifying customer base thrived. The ones that didn't lost their leases and were replaced with tenants who understood the assignment. Revenue started climbing. The Galleria went from struggling to profitable within 8 months. And the story of what had happened that October afternoon became part of the property's legend. New employees were told about it during orientation as an example of why the Galleria's values mattered. Customers who'd seen the viral video sometimes recognized Adrienne and thanked her for standing her ground. And Adrienne used the moment as a teaching tool in her talks at business schools and conferences, explaining how personal experience with discrimination had informed her business model and why diversity wasn't just morally right but financially smart. As for Crawford, he became a cautionary tale. His assault on Adrienne had been so well documented and so clearly wrong that he couldn't find security work anywhere in Maryland. He tried to rehabilitate his image with a Fox News interview where he positioned himself as a victim of cancel culture, but the video evidence was too damning, and even sympathetic commentators couldn't make his actions look justified. He'd filed for bankruptcy within a year. And while Adrienne took no particular pleasure in his suffering, she also didn't regret the role she'd played in it. Actions had consequences. Discrimination had costs. And sometimes the cost was your entire career and reputation. 2 years after the assault, Adrienne stood in the renovated Riverside Galleria atrium at an event celebrating the property's designation as a model for inclusive retail development. The fountain had been replaced with a beautiful public art installation created by a local Black artist. The stores surrounding the atrium represented the demographic reality of suburban Maryland. And the customers moving through the space reflected that diversity, everyone shopping and browsing and existing without being followed or questioned or assumed to be anything other than what they were. People with money to spend who deserved to be treated with respect. The mayor gave a speech about economic inclusion. The local NAACP chapter presented Adrienne with an award. And when it was her turn to speak, Adrienne looked out at the crowd and thought about that moment 2 years ago when Crawford had grabbed her shoulder and tried to throw her out of a building she owned. "When I was assaulted in this very spot," she began, "I had a choice. I could have walked away, could have pressed criminal charges and moved on, could have let that moment define me as a victim. Instead, I chose to let it define me as an owner with the power to change things, not just for me, but for everyone who comes after me. Every Black teenager who wants to shop here without being followed. Every Latino family who wants to feel welcome. Every person who's been made to feel like they don't belong in spaces like this." She paused. "What happened to me wasn't unique. It happens every day to people who don't have the resources or the platform or the ownership stake to fight back. So I'm fighting back for all of us. This building is proof that change is possible, that businesses can be profitable and inclusive, that security can keep people safe without treating them as threats, that retail can serve everyone, not just the people who've traditionally been centered in these spaces." The applause was thunderous, but what mattered more to Adrienne than the recognition was the 11-year-old Black girl she saw standing near the fountain with her mother, both of them holding shopping bags from stores that hadn't existed in the Galleria 2 years ago, both of them looking comfortable and welcome and unbothered. That girl would shop in this space without being harassed, would grow up in a world that was incrementally better because Adrienne had refused to let that moment in the atrium break her, would maybe own her own business someday and remember that change was possible because someone had proved it. After the ceremony, Adrienne walked through the Galleria one more time, past the stores she'd recruited and the security guards she'd hired and the customers who no longer had to worry about being judged for the color of their skin while trying to buy a dress or a pair of shoes. She thought about calling her mother to tell her about the award and the speech and how far they'd come. Then she remembered that Patricia was gone, but somehow also more present than ever in the work Adrienne did. This was her mother's legacy, the belief that excellence was the answer, that documentation mattered, that power should be used to lift people up, not keep them out, that a girl from West Baltimore could grow up to own the kind of building that used to make her feel unwelcome, and in owning it, transform it into something better. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you understand something crucial about justice and power and the long arc of change. Dr. Adrienne Marshall didn't get even with Dennis Crawford by destroying his life. She got even by building something better, by taking the building where she was assaulted and turning it into proof that discrimination isn't just wrong, it's bad business, by using her ownership and her authority to make sure that what happened to her happened to fewer people going forward. Crawford lost his job and his reputation not because Adrienne was vindictive, but because his actions had natural consequences